So, what's up?
Okay. Here for another podcast.
The Reddit podcast, Reddit edition. Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm excited for this one.
Frequently asked questions.
Yes, something like that. All right,
Let's go.
The first one is deposition advice. Mm-hmm. Can anyone prepare me to sit for a deposition? I was injured in a car wreck that was not my fault, but the defendant does not want to pay for any medical. We have been fighting for over a year to settle. Now I have to be deposed and I'm nervous. What is it like?
Okay, so that is a good question.
It is.
I think first the most important thing to remember is that a deposition is a discovery device. So you're not in a courtroom.
Okay.
It's not really a court proceeding. There's no judge.
So is it a conference room?
Yeah, it could be a conference room. The last one I did was even in a conference room in a local library.
Okay.
So it was myself, the other attorney, the client that was being deposed, and a stenographer.
Okay.
All around a table in a library. It's about gathering information. So it's a question and answer session about what happened in the accident.
So question.
Sure.
Can they ask you things that do not pertain to the accident?
Well, they can ask you, I guess, personal background information. Make sure you are the person that you say you are. Right. But it should be on point for the subject matter. You know, when you're being deposed, you have your attorney with you. Mm-hmm. And they'll sit next to you. And if things get out of line, they'll object.
Does that ever happen? Do adjusters ever ask, like, well, okay, so records are ordered, like medical records, mm-hmm. pretty much a lot of them.
Yeah.
And things will come up that maybe don't pertain to the accident, like
therapy sessions.
Yeah, like other diseases, things like that don't pertain to the accident, and they start to question: Are they allowed to do that?
They shouldn't be unless it pertains. They might end up asking something. If you don't feel like it's a big deal, you might allow your client to answer, but you would put your objection on the record.
Okay.
Because that can determine later whether or not that information can be used at trial. Mm-hmm. Right? Remember, it's not necessarily a court proceeding at that point. It is simply a discovery tool to gather information.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think, too, just quickly, it would also be another attorney. It wouldn't be a claims adjuster. So it wouldn't be somebody from the insurance company asking you questions.
Okay.
The insurance company would hire an attorney in this example, and they would ask questions. Mm-hmm. But it really isn't, the person writing that, it really isn't something for them to worry about. They should just be honest. They'll have their attorney there if things, go off the rails. Yeah, exactly.
They start asking you about the time you had pneumonia in first grade.
Yes. They can object and
okay.
And it'll be fine. So I think in terms of advice about preparing for it, mm-hmm. I think the biggest thing is answering the questions that are asked. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times when people are nervous, especially, they have a tendency to just keep talking and keep providing information.
Okay.
So for example, if the attorney asked you if it's raining outside, you can say yes.
Like, was it raining? Yes.
But you don't want to say, no, it's not raining, but it rained yesterday, and
mm-hmm.
In the forecast it's going to rain tomorrow, and it's a little damp from yesterday.
Okay.
People tend to keep going, and attorneys love to ask questions. They're trained to ask questions. So if you give them a reason to keep following up over and over again, they'll take that opportunity.
So answer the question directly. Do not elaborate.
Right. Make sure you're answering the question and answering it honestly, mm-hmm. but just answer the question that they're asking. And don't guess. If you don't know or if you don't remember, mm-hmm. that's what you say. I think that's probably the best advice in terms of being ready to go in there.
When do you think trying to keep your cool might be something as well? Because attorneys can get kind of aggressive.
Yeah, they can tend to poke.
Yes.
You have to remember that they have a job to do and they're just doing their job and they're trained a certain way.
Right.
To keep answering questions. Sometimes you feel like they're answering the same one mm-hmm. in just a different way. I think, again, it goes back to, just answering the questions that are asked it can take as long as it needs to. And the same goes for getting worked up. The more you get worked up and argue back, there's no winning there.
Right.
They're going to ask the questions they want to ask. Right. So I think you just keep your cool, you be honest, answer the questions that are asked, and it would go well.
Cool. All right, the next one. These next two are my favorite.
Okay.
I think they're funny. Okay. All right, so lawyers of Reddit, what are your strategies to defending a false confession? So, false confessions happen in a lot of cases, but how do you defend a person who was given a false confession? It can be at home, the police station, or the jailhouse. How do you defend these kinds of cases?
Well, I think first of all,
interesting.
This is interesting. I have to say, I think false confessions are rare.
Okay.
I think that
less than what this person thinks.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I do. I think, in today's climate, I think that stuff that's put out there by the media, makes it seem like it's more common than it is. Like popular shows like Making a Murderer and, other things you see on TV, like on Netflix and HBO, would probably lead you to believe more that this happens probably more than it does.
Okay.
But obviously that's not to say that it doesn't happen. I think that it's important to note that there are obviously rules depending on what state you're in, and some rules that apply to every state about what an officer can do for an interrogation, right? I know on our previous podcast, we talked about Miranda rights.
Yeah.
All right, there are rules about interrogation, not using force or the threat of force, how long you can keep somebody in an interrogation room, right? You can't leave them in there for 48 hours without food or water and then go in and ask them, to confess. And in terms of, what did they ask? How you defend the cases. So every person's entitled to a Huntley hearing in New York, and that is a hearing before a judge where the prosecution is required to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the confession was lawful and voluntary.
Okay.
So that's an opportunity to challenge that in court. And of course, if you ended up being convicted, you can possibly have an appeal based on that. I think that if you did have a situation where you were a defense lawyer and you were defending somebody and you felt as if they falsely confessed, I think that obviously challenging it at the hearing, but then if the case were to go to trial, I think that, maybe your client would testify, that what they said wasn't accurate, or they don't testify and the attorney just attacks the officer that did the interrogation to try to show that it was false. And, I think one way you can do that is looking for inconsistencies in the confession. So, for example, if they admitted to something as part of their confession to the officer that just couldn't be true, and you can show as the defense that it's not true, and you say, well, you can't believe anything in that confession because the information that he was offering to the officer, some of it just couldn't have been true. So why should you believe any of it's true?
So the evidence is kind of going to show whether it supports that person's confession or not.
Right.
Yeah. I mean.
But if they're confessing to something that only the person who did the crime could know, and it's corroborated by evidence, right, that could be bad for you.
Right.
But it could also be helpful in the reverse.
Right. Also, as a defense attorney, can't you just claim insanity?
You can claim insanity. I guess, but then it might not be a false confession, right? They might confess, but your argument is that he should be not guilty by reason of insanity, in which that he could, if convicted, though, would end up spending time in some type of psych
facility. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. Because I also feel like that's kind of hard to prove, especially if the person doesn't have any record of mental illness.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it would really be a battle of experts at that point. So I'm sure the prosecution would have their expert on one side to say this person is sane, and then they'd be evaluated by an expert, paid by the defense, and they would say, no, this person is in fact crazy, and they couldn't appreciate the consequences of their actions.
All right.
So Is this your second favorite
This
one?
is my
next?
second favorite one because I feel like this would be insanity. So this person states, seeing as you can't be tried twice for the same crime, what would happen if you yelled, quote, "You idiots, I was guilty the whole time," end quote, immediately after being declared innocent?
Okay.
So
I mean, this is a very dramatic
It's a very
example.
dramatic example, but the question is what if you do confess to the crime
Afterwards?
after you've been, claimed innocent?
So we have double jeopardy,
Yeah.
right? You can't be tried for the same crime twice, but that applies to, whatever agency or sovereign is prosecuting you, right? So I guess for an example, like O.J. Simpson, right? He was tried by, it was the state of California?
Yeah. Brentwood.
Yes. So the state can't then, if he went outside after and says, haha, I did it, they can't then retry him. Double jeopardy attaches.
Okay.
But, you can be sued civilly for money, right? And, I'm sure that if you were admitting to it, that could be used against you. Also, there might be federal charges that could attach.
Okay. So that doesn't apply.
Right. That might not apply to federal.
Okay.
I think that a good example here locally was Charlie Tan. That was a big case in the news. Pittsford case. The case was dismissed during the trial.
Okay.
If he came out and said, actually I did it, right, he couldn't then be retried.
Okay.
But he was then prosecuted federally.
Okay.
Based on the same, it was a gun charge, a federal gun charge, but it was really based on the same incident. And he is in prison for that. So he was prosecuted again by a different sovereignty after.
Okay. It's kind of crazy though, because he wasn't, like, he was being charged, what was it, murder, right?
Yes.
And he it didn't stick, right? But then he has a gun charge, which would insinuate that he had a gun and shot somebody.
Correct, right.
But
it was almost a way for...
Not murder?
Right.
What?
Because there needs to be some kind of jurisdictional hook for a certain area to prosecute you, right? And there was a way, I'm not 100% familiar, but there was a way in which they were able to find federal charges to prosecute him for the gun, right? But not necessarily the murder.
So they could prove that he had a gun, possession of the gun, used the gun, but not
whatever the elements,
whatever it was.
Whatever the elements of that
For
crime
example,
were.
yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. So it's the same incident, right? But you have federal charges and state charges.
Yeah.
And you can be acquitted on one and still prosecuted federally.
I just think it's crazy.
If this guy had, some kind of, charge that could have been prosecuted federally, and he says that afterwards, and it's an open court and recorded. Yeah. I mean, maybe they could do that, or they can sue them. Like OJ made that book, What If I Did It, or If I Did It, I think it was called.
Oh my God.
I think he actually claimed he didn't write it. It was his manager or someone, but it was supposed to be a hypothetical about what would have happened if he did it.
So could that have just been his confession? Maybe. We'll never know.
We'll never know. But, I mean, could he, let's just pretend he really wrote a book describing how he did it. Yeah, I mean, double jeopardy.
And then
applies.
he couldn't get charged.
Yeah, I mean, who knows if somebody could find some other charges based on it, or, if there's some kind of federal hook. But, yeah, the state isn't going to just retry him for the same exact crime.
I don't really know how that's fair and just if someone then confesses or said, I actually did do it, and then they can't be held accountable after. I don't know.
Yeah.
Isn't that odd? I get it. It's the law, but I'm just saying, in my opinion, that's weird. So
it seems unfair, but remember that in our justice system, you have to prove somebody's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And that burden is on whatever agency is prosecuting, the a state district attorney's office, the U.S. attorney's office. That's the system that we have. And if they're not able to do it, even if the person is guilty, then it is what it is. Yeah.
Yikes.
But that is an interesting question.
Okay, so this one is interesting. The guy who wrote this, or girl, I don't really know. It's very dramatic. All these people today are very dramatic, so.
These are some crazy examples.
Yes. So leaving before cops arrive. So this hasn't happened to me personally. Okay. So if for whatever reason, am I in the right legally? For example, a public store like Target, and a Karen does a Karen-like thing to a point where the law enforcement is called, whether by her or the store, am I allowed to just leave? Or am I obligated to stay and tell them what was going on? So I think this person is basically asking, do I have to stay once the cops have been called if you're not a part of whatever the situation is?
Yeah, no.
Like you're just kind of observing it.
Right. No, you don't.
Right? That's not like leaving the scene of a crime. Well, it's different, right? Like we're talking about like disputes versus like someone getting hit by a car or something.
Yeah, I think an easy example is probably car accidents, right? If I get into an accident with you and I leave the scene, that's actually a misdemeanor, leaving the scene of a property damage accident without reporting.
Okay.
But if I witness you and Bob get in a car accident,
great,
right, and you guys call the cops, and they're coming to the scene, and I'm a witness, and I know exactly what happened, I don't have a legal obligation to stay.
Okay.
I should. It's the right thing to do.
Yes, that would be nice.
Yeah, it would be nice. I think that, to tell them what happened.
Right.
It could be helpful if somebody was hurt and something wrong was done to them.
Right.
Or one of the other parties then fled the scene and you got their license plate. It would be nice of you to stay and let the police officer know.
Yes.
But no, you're not required to.
Interesting. I always thought you were, I guess, but that makes sense.
There's no charge for it.
You're not really part of it. Yeah. Interesting.
And I can't even imagine the resources it would take to figure out who was at the scene and was a witness and go and find them and bring them in and charge them.
Well, if it's Karen at Target, I'm sure she would know. She'll find it.
Yeah, Karen will find the witness. Absolutely. Without a doubt.
I loved how this person asked. Okay. All right. Our last one is punched in the face. The titles. Wow. All right, I was punched in the face by my ex's father on his property. I didn't hit him first or retaliate after he hit me. I simply called the cops and left his property until the police arrived on scene. It has now been 20 days since this happened, and I cannot see out of my left eye. The local police department continues to state that this is nothing but harassment and no charges can be filed. Is there another way I can press charges, and do I have a credible lawsuit on my hands?
Okay. So, no, it's up to the police or the district attorney's office to charge them with the crime.
Is it harassment or is it assault?
It would... Are we pretending this is in New York?
Yes, this is a New York case.
Okay.
Let's pretend.
This would be assault.
Okay.
Because they were injured.
Yeah.
Right? If they were punched in the face and they were just annoyed, right, it would be harassment. That would be a violation. It's essentially the same as a traffic ticket. But if I punched you in the eye and you couldn't see out of your eye,
right,
that's an assault.
Okay.
Sure. Now, could they sue them? Yes, you could. What you'll get, I think, is another question.
Okay.
So typically, like a homeowner's insurance wouldn't cover an intentional act.
Okay.
You have insurance for accidents. They're not going to insure you in case you decide to attack somebody and blind them, right? And then they agree to pay, for that. That's the easiest way to get money in a civil lawsuit is when you have insurance companies involved, right? Like, again, car accidents, slip and falls, construction accidents. This kind of situation would be much more difficult.
Okay.
So could you bring a lawsuit? Sure. But I think that, you have to remember there are certain protections depending on what state you live in for certain assets that you can obtain.
Right.
So
if they're broke, or they don't have anything to
give you, right.
Yeah,
I mean, you could obtain a judgment against them, but when you have a judgment, there are certain laws, depending on what state you're in, of certain things that are protected, a certain amount of equity in your primary home, retirement accounts, and that's where people really have the bulk of their money.
Okay.
Maybe this guy's his ex's father was Bill Gates and or Jeff Bezos, so. And then you have a different story.
Okay.
But if it's not, it would be difficult.
If it's normal average people, the likelihood of you recouping anything is probably
of value, right?
Not.
Yeah, I mean, I can't. Maybe he has $50,000 in jewelry.
But legally, you could try.
Legally, you could try. I think another good example is O.J. Simpson. Again, right? He was sued civilly after he was acquitted. He was found liable, and I think it's probably $30 million, something like that.
Okay.
Was awarded against him.
Do you know what he was liable for?
The murder.
Okay.
Yes.
So, actually, the murder that he was not.
Correct.
Charged or convicted.
He wasn't convicted criminally, right?
Yes.
Remember, it's a different standard.
Right.
So the criminal is beyond a reasonable doubt, and the civil is by a preponderance of the evidence. So think of that as more like 51%, right? Is it more likely than not that he did it? So
another question to that, though, would be if you're going to sue, if there's a criminal and civil matter, do you sue after the criminal case is completed or at the same time?
You don't have to, but you probably should, because if you get a conviction, you've already proven the act beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a higher standard than the civil. And then you can do what's called collateral estoppel, which basically says that you can't challenge, you were already convicted of it, and you can't challenge that you didn't do it. Now, you could still probably have a trial over the damages, over what it's worth, but you can be granted basically what's called summary judgment on the actual liability.
All right. I think we've done a couple of those cases.
Yeah, we have. Yeah. I think it was a motor vehicle accident where they were convicted of driving while intoxicated. So, you can use that as evidence to say, they caused the accident and it was their fault.
I think in criminal too, if something, not DW, I'm not talking about car accidents, but if something, I don't know, I think we've had a couple where it's more criminal based and then there's something civil out of it as well. So
yeah. It won't always apply collateral estoppel, but it has to be the same type of offense, and they had to be given a fair opportunity to litigate it before. But with respect to the judgment against OJ for the millions, based on the law in Florida where he had his home, that couldn't be recovered.
Really?
So he wasn't forced to then sell his house to pay them.
Okay.
Also, his pension from the NFL, they also weren't able to get that as well. So again, that's obviously a very rich guy, and there were certain things they weren't able to get.
Had the assets.
So it just depends on what state you're in. Bankruptcy attorneys would know, what type of stuff creditors can go after. So probably a long way of saying you're probably not going to get much for this guy that was punched by his ex's dad.
Yeah. At least, I'm assuming this is just a normal average family.
Unless it was, Bill Gates.
Family dispute.
Well, hopefully we helped out some Reddit users.
Yes. Dramatic, but fun.
A lot of Karens.
Fun to read.
Absolutely.
All right. Done. That concludes this episode of the King Law Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe and check out our socials at King Law Attorneys. And if you've happened to have been injured or charged with a crime, now you know who to call. King Law. Take charge.